They called it agriculture. They called it commerce. They called it the Southern way of life. But behind every bale of cotton, behind every column of profit in those leather-bound ledgers, was a human being, chained, beaten, and stripped of everything except the will to survive. This is not a story about numbers or economics. This is a story about what human beings are capable of doing to one another, and what human beings are capable of enduring. What really happened inside the cotton plantations of the American South will stay with you long after this is over. Inside the most horrific breeding farms of cotton plantations, journey back to a time when America was torn apart by the evil of slavery, a moral battle that would rip the nation at its seams. These are the stories of those who fought for freedom and of those who grew rich from oppression. The origins of slavery in America reach back to the late 1400s, when a merciless system known as the transatlantic slave trade took shape. Over a span of more than 300 years, from 1525 to 1866, an estimated 12.5 million Africans were torn from their homes and forced across the Atlantic Ocean against their will. Tragically, only about 10.7 million survived the brutal crossing. The early 1600s marked a grim turning point in North America. In 1619, a ship carrying around 20 enslaved Africans arrived at Point Comfort, Virginia. It seemed like a small event at the time, a mere footnote in the grand sweep of history. But this arrival, this forced disembarkation onto foreign soil, was a pivotal moment that would set the stage for centuries of systematic enslavement across the American colonies.
The Ghanaian scholar Abina Busha, a powerful voice for justice and equality, recognized the profound weight of this moment. She wrote that the story of the African in the Americas begins with a river of tears and a trail of blood. Those words, etched with pain and truth, capture the essence of the African experience in the New World, a story of unimaginable suffering, resilience, and an enduring struggle for freedom. But why did this happen? What drove European colonists to embrace such a cruel and inhumane system? The answer lies largely in economics. The colonies held the promise of vast agricultural wealth, but cultivating labor-intensive crops like tobacco, cotton, and sugar required a large and readily available workforce. Initially, colonists relied on indentured servants from Europe, people who agreed to work for a set period in exchange for passage to the New World. But that system proved insufficient to meet the growing demand for labor.
And so, driven by greed and a callous disregard for human life, plantation owners turned to the enslavement of Africans, seeing them not as human beings with rights and dreams, but as commodities to be bought, sold, and exploited for profit. In the early 1700s, the institution of slavery in America took a sinister turn, its grip on the land and its people tightening like a vice. In 1705, Virginia, a colony founded on the ideals of freedom and opportunity, passed a law that would forever stain its history. That law made slaves perpetually enslaved, solidifying the concept of chattel slavery, where human beings were legally treated as mere property. This chilling legal maneuver was driven by two powerful forces: the insatiable demand for cheap labor to fuel the growing colonial economy, and the deep-seated fear of the burgeoning African population.
As the number of enslaved Africans grew, so too did the anxieties of white colonists, who sought to create a system that would ensure their dominance and maintain the profitability of their plantations. Even some of the founding fathers, those who championed liberty and self-governance, recognized the hypocrisy at the heart of this system. In 1773, Benjamin Franklin penned a letter lamenting the moral contradictions of the British Empire. He pointed out the absurdity of Britain priding itself on freeing enslaved people who landed on its shores while simultaneously allowing its merchants to profit handsomely from the very trade that had enslaved them in the first place. The roots of this deeply flawed system could be traced back to 1619, when the first slave farm in North America was established in Jamestown, Virginia.
What began as a small-scale enterprise would, by the late 17th century, become deeply entrenched in the social and economic fabric of the Southern colonies. The invention of the cotton gin in 1793 by Eli Whitney revolutionized the cotton industry, transforming the South into a vast cotton kingdom. This technological advancement, while seemingly beneficial, had a devastating consequence. It dramatically increased the demand for enslaved labor, as plantation owners rushed to expand their cotton acreage and reap the profits of a booming market. South Carolina, in particular, saw its enslaved population explode, fueled by the insatiable appetite for raw cotton from textile mills in the North and across the Atlantic in Britain. The lives of millions of African Americans were now inextricably bound to the production of this white gold, their bodies and spirits sacrificed on the altar of economic greed. By the early 1800s, the moral debate over slavery could no longer be ignored. Abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison declared in 1831 that the nation would have to decide whether the slave-holding, soul-driving system would be allowed to continue. The nation stood at a crossroads, forced to confront the fundamental question of whether a society founded on the principles of liberty and equality could go on tolerating the brutal institution of slavery. As the 19th century progressed, slave farms spread like a malignant growth across the South, concentrated along the fertile coastal areas and the banks of the Mississippi River. The 1860 census painted a stark and disturbing picture. Nearly 4 million enslaved people, the vast majority toiling on plantations, their lives and labor fueling the wealth of a nation built on their suffering. Shadows of the plantation, the harrowing reality of enslaved life. As the sun crested the horizon and cast its golden rays across the vast fields of the American South, enslaved people were already at work. Their lives were a relentless cycle of toil, suffering, and the ever-present threat of violence. Their very existence was defined by the shadows of the plantation, a world where their humanity was denied and their bodies and spirits were broken under the yoke of slavery. Henry Bibb, a former slave who tasted the bitter fruit of freedom, wrote, "I was a slave, a prisoner for life. I could possess nothing but what must belong to my keeper." Those words captured the essence of their dehumanized status. They were not seen as individuals with rights and dreams, but as mere possessions, tools to be used and discarded at the whim of their enslavers. Their living conditions were abysmal, a stark contrast to the opulent mansions of the plantation owners. Families were crammed into tiny, dilapidated cabins, often with dirt floors and leaking roofs.
At Magnolia Plantation in South Carolina, some cabins housed as many as 10 people in a space barely larger than a modern-day bathroom. Privacy was a luxury they could not afford, their lives constantly exposed to the gaze of others. Frederick Douglass, in his powerful autobiography, describes similar conditions. Enslaved people forced to live in cramped and unsanitary quarters, their dignity stripped away. Food was scarce and of poor quality, barely enough to sustain the grueling labor they were forced to endure. Their meager rations typically consisted of cornmeal, pork fat, and molasses, a diet that lacked essential nutrients and left them vulnerable to disease. Solomon Northup, in his harrowing memoir, described the inadequate food provided to enslaved people, writing that the weekly allowance was a peck of corn and 3 or 4 pounds of pork, with a little salt.
Malnutrition and diseases like cholera and pneumonia were rampant, ravaging the slave quarters and claiming countless lives. Workdays were long and grueling, stretching from sunrise to sunset with little rest. Cotton pickers, their hands raw and bleeding, were expected to pick an impossible 200 pounds of cotton each day. Failure to meet these quotas resulted in severe punishments, often at the hands of a brutal overseer. Douglass described the horrific brutality he witnessed. The louder she screamed, the harder he whipped. Where the blood ran fastest, there he whipped longest. Even children as young as 3 were not spared from the horrors of plantation labor. They were forced to carry water, tend livestock, or look after younger children, their childhood innocence stolen from them.
Moses Roper, an escaped slave, wrote in 1852, "I have often seen the overseer beat my mother when she was in travail," a chilling testament to the depths of cruelty inflicted upon enslaved people. Medical care was virtually non-existent. When enslaved people fell ill, they were often left to suffer and die without any form of treatment. J. Marion Sims, a doctor whose legacy is now stained by his unethical practices, performed horrific experiments on enslaved women without anesthesia, using their bodies as research subjects without their consent. The average life expectancy for an enslaved person in 1850 was a mere 21.4 years, a stark reminder of the toll that slavery took on their physical and mental well-being. The psychological impact of slavery was profound and devastating. Families were routinely separated, children sold away from their parents like livestock, leaving behind a trail of heartbreak and despair. The story of Celia, a slave who killed her owner in self-defense against his repeated advances, illustrates the horrific mistreatment and vulnerability of enslaved women. William Wells Brown, a former slave who found refuge in the North, wrote, "Slavery has fixed a deep gulf, a dark abyss, a chasm of pain and suffering that separated enslaved people from the rest of humanity. Sparks of defiance, resistance, and rebellion. Even in the darkest depths of slavery, the human spirit refused to be extinguished." In the cramped and dimly lit slave quarters, whispers of resistance circulated like a hidden current, a testament to the unyielding desire for freedom that burned within the hearts of enslaved people. They fought back against their oppressors in countless ways, both subtle and overt, demonstrating their courage and resilience in the face of unimaginable adversity.
Harriet Tubman, the legendary conductor on the Underground Railroad, famously said, "I had reasoned this out in my mind. There was one of 2 things I had a right to: liberty or death." Those words encapsulate the fierce determination that fueled the resistance movement. Enslaved people understood that freedom was their birthright, and they were willing to risk everything to claim it. One common form of resistance was work slowdowns. Enslaved people would feign illness, break tools, or simply work at a deliberately slow pace, subtly disrupting the plantation's productivity and challenging the authority of their enslavers. Frederick Douglass, in his autobiography, recounted how enslaved people used music as a form of resistance, singing coded songs that expressed their longing for freedom and their defiance of the system that held them captive. The shout, a rhythmic call-and-response tradition that developed on the Sea Islands, was another powerful example of cultural resistance. This unique musical form combined spiritual expression with covert communication, allowing enslaved people to share messages of hope and solidarity under the guise of religious practice. Escape attempts were frequent and daring. The Underground Railroad, a clandestine network of routes and safe houses, became a lifeline for thousands of enslaved people seeking freedom in the North. Harriet Tubman risked her own life to lead an estimated 70 enslaved people to freedom. William Still, a free black man who played a crucial role in the Underground Railroad, helped over 800 people escape to safety. He wrote in 1872,
"The heroism should be kept green in the memory of this and coming generations, a testament to the courage and determination of those who risked everything for a chance at freedom."
But resistance was not limited to individual acts of defiance. There were also large-scale revolts that shook the foundations of the slave-holding South. The Stono Rebellion of 1739 saw a group of enslaved Africans rise up in South Carolina, killing at least 20 white people and striking terror into the hearts of slaveholders. The rebellion, which lasted for several days, was brutally suppressed, but it demonstrated the potential for organized resistance and the deep-seated anger that simmered beneath the surface of plantation life. Historian Peter H. Wood wrote that the Stono Rebellion was the largest revolt in Britain's mainland colonies, underscoring its significance in the history of slave resistance. Nat Turner's 1831 rebellion in Virginia was another pivotal moment in the fight for freedom. Turner, an enslaved preacher, led a group of around 70 enslaved and free black people in a bloody uprising that resulted in the deaths of an estimated 55 white people. The rebellion, though ultimately crushed, sent shockwaves through the South, leading to increased paranoia and the enactment of even stricter slave codes. Before his execution, Turner declared, "I am loaded with chains, but this is nothing compared to how I have been bound by my fellow creatures," a powerful statement that underscored the dehumanizing nature of slavery and the lengths to which enslaved people were willing to go to break free. The German Coast Uprising of 1811, the largest slave revolt in United States history, saw between 250 and 500 enslaved people march on New Orleans, armed with sugarcane knives and fueled by a burning desire for freedom. Led by Charles DeLand, they burned plantations before being brutally suppressed by the militia. Over 100 enslaved people were killed in the aftermath, many beheaded as a warning to others who might dare to challenge the system. One rebel leader declared, "We will show these whites that we are men, not beasts of burden," a defiant cry that echoed the sentiments of countless others who yearned to be recognized as human beings. Despite the brutal reprisals that often followed acts of resistance, the spirit of defiance could not be extinguished. William Wells Brown wrote, "The slave is a thing, a marketable commodity, and yet he is a man." A powerful reminder that even in the eyes of the law, enslaved people were still human beings with inherent dignity and a right to freedom. Maria Stewart, a free black woman and abolitionist, issued a stirring call to action in 1833, urging black women to rise up and fight for their liberation. "O ye daughters of Africa, awake! Show forth that you are endowed with noble faculties." Her words resonated with enslaved and free black women alike, inspiring them to join the growing movement for abolition and to demand their rightful place in society. Slavery's central role in America's rise. The rhythmic clang of hammers, the creak of wagons, and the mournful songs of enslaved people. These were the sounds that echoed through the vast cotton fields of the American South, a symphony of forced labor that fueled the economic engine propelling the United States to global prominence. But this prosperity came at a terrible human cost, a cost that can never be truly calculated. Frederick Douglass wrote with searing clarity about the dehumanizing nature of slavery. The slaveholding regime regards the slave as a thing, a commodity. Enslaved people were not seen as individuals with rights and dreams, but as mere instruments of profit, their bodies and spirits reduced to entries on a ledger. This dehumanization was enshrined in law, as evidenced by the 1705 Virginia Slave Code, which stripped enslaved people of their basic human rights and codified their status as property.
The economic importance of slave labor, particularly in the South, cannot be overstated. By 1860, enslaved people represented 13% of the United States population, forming the backbone of the plantation system that dominated the Southern economy. Their value was estimated at a staggering $3.5 billion, the equivalent of nearly $1 trillion today. Historian Walter Johnson aptly noted that slavery was not just a labor system. It was the nation's largest financial asset. The 1860 census revealed a shocking truth. The South's enslaved population was more valuable than all of its railroads, factories, and banks combined. The profits derived from slave labor permeated every aspect of the American economy. Cotton, picked by the calloused hands of enslaved people, was shipped to northern textile mills, where it was transformed into cloth and exported around the world.
By 1850, cotton accounted for over half of all United States exports, making it the nation's most valuable commodity. Senator James Henry Hammond of South Carolina declared in 1858, "Cotton is king, and no power dares to make war upon it," a statement that reflected the South's unwavering belief in the economic and political power of its slave-based economy. But the profits from slavery did not stay in the South. They flowed northward, fueling the growth of industries and financial institutions in the North. New England's textile mills, for example, were heavily dependent on Southern cotton, creating a complex and deeply intertwined economic relationship between the two regions. Historian Eric Foner noted that the slave economy had ripple effects, with merchants across the country profiting from the slave trade, highlighting the widespread complicity in the system of slavery.
William Lloyd Garrison recognized this complicity and condemned it without hesitation. "Every man who eats the bread of slavery is a man-stealer." He understood that the economic benefits of slavery extended far beyond plantation owners, and that many Northerners, through their consumption of slave-produced goods and their investments in businesses that profited from slavery, were indirectly sustaining this brutal system. Slavery's economic reach extended far beyond the borders of the United States. Southern cotton fed the textile mills of Great Britain, fueling the Industrial Revolution that was transforming the world. By 1860, nearly 80% of the cotton used in Britain came from the American South. Historians Beckert and Baptist write that cotton, and with it slavery, became the driving force of a globally interconnected economy, highlighting the worldwide significance of slavery and its impact on the course of history.
Whispers in the Quarters, the hidden world of enslaved culture. As darkness descended upon the plantations of the American South, a different kind of life stirred in the slave quarters. Hushed voices mingled with soft laughter as enslaved people gathered in the flickering lamplight, finding solace and strength in the shared bonds of community. They told stories of their homelands, sang songs that echoed across the ocean, and whispered prayers to their ancestors, preserving a rich cultural heritage that slavery sought to erase. Frederick Douglass wrote, "The slave's happiness is not the end sought by slavery. It is necessary to darken his moral vision." But despite the dehumanizing efforts of the slaveholding system, enslaved people found ways to nurture their spirits and to create beauty and meaning in a world designed to crush them. Their cultural practices were as diverse as the African nations from which they had been stolen. Historian Ira Berlin noted that the African diaspora was a cultural diaspora. Enslaved Africans brought with them a tapestry of languages, religions, and traditions, weaving them together to create a vibrant and resilient culture in the New World. Preserving their ancestral religions was a vital act of resistance. Despite efforts by slaveholders to convert them to Christianity, many enslaved people continued to practice their native religions in secret, finding solace and strength in the spiritual traditions of their ancestors. Historian Albert J. Raboteau estimates that only about 10% of enslaved people were Christian by 1860. Others practiced religions like Vodun, Santeria, and Conjure, using charms, herbal remedies, and rituals to heal the sick, protect themselves from harm, and connect with the spiritual world.
William Wells Brown recalled, There was not a man but that believed in conjuration, highlighting the widespread belief in the power of these traditional practices. These religious ceremonies often took place in hidden locations, known as brush arbor meetings, or hush harbors, where enslaved people could gather in secret, away from the watchful eyes of their enslavers. Music and dance were also integral to their cultural expression, serving as both a source of solace and a form of resistance. Work songs, spirituals, and field haulers provided a rhythmic backdrop to their labors, a means of communication and a powerful outlet for their emotions. Lawrence Levine, a scholar of African American culture, wrote that the spirituals are full of double meanings which describe their relationship to their masters. Songs like Steal Away to Jesus contained hidden messages about escape and freedom, while others express the deep sorrow and longing for a better life.
Music and dance also played a crucial role in preserving African heritage. In New Orleans, enslaved people gathered in Congo Square on Sundays, drumming, singing, and dancing, keeping the traditions of their ancestors alive. Similar gatherings took place on plantations throughout the South, providing a space for enslaved people to express their cultural identity and to find a sense of community. The ring shout, a circular dance that combined African and European elements, was a particularly popular form of expression. Its rhythmic movements and call and response vocals created a powerful sense of unity and shared experience. Family and kinship networks were the bedrock of enslaved communities. Despite the constant threat of separation through sale or forced relocation, enslaved people forged strong bonds of family and community, providing each other with emotional support, practical assistance, and a sense of belonging in a world that sought to isolate and dehumanize them. Historian Herbert Gutman writes that the most significant social union was the family household, highlighting the central role that family played in the lives of enslaved people. The importance of family is reflected in the naming practices of enslaved people. Parents often gave their children African names or used surnames to denote kinship ties, even though they had no legal right to do so. Historian Brenda Stevenson writes that surnames provided a means to assert self and kin, demonstrating the powerful symbolic significance of names in maintaining a sense of identity and connection in the face of slavery's efforts to erase them. Sojourner Truth, born Isabella Baumfree, chose her name to reflect her newfound identity as a free woman and an activist for abolition and women's rights. Her name became a powerful symbol of her self-determination and her commitment to fighting for the liberation of all oppressed people. These cultural practices were not merely a means of survival, they were also acts of resistance. By maintaining their own traditions, their language, their music, their religion, and their family bonds, enslaved people asserted their humanity and their refusal to be defined solely by their enslavement. Douglass wrote, "The slave system was utterly hateful to me. I hated everything that reminded me of my condition." Their cultural expressions were a powerful way of reclaiming their identity, their dignity, and their hope for a future free from the chains of oppression. The Unshackling, America's long march toward emancipation. In 1831, a small group of determined individuals gathered in Boston to form the New England Anti-Slavery Society, one of the first organized abolitionist groups in the United States. William Lloyd Garrison declared in his newly founded newspaper, The Liberator, "I will be as harsh as truth. I do not wish to think or speak with moderation." His uncompromising stance and unwavering commitment to immediate abolition would inspire a generation of activists and galvanize the movement for freedom. Quaker poet John Greenleaf Whittier captured the growing spirit of resistance in his 1833 poem, "No more shall the sighing of the slave rise in dread appeal." His words resonated with those who believed that slavery was a moral stain on the nation's soul, and that it was time to break the chains of oppression. The roots of the abolitionist movement could be traced back to the Quakers, a religious group that had long opposed slavery on moral grounds. In 1775, Anthony Benezet, a French immigrant and Quaker, founded the first abolitionist society in the United States. Benezet wrote in 1762, "The Negroes are our fellow creatures. They have the same right to liberty that we have." That sentiment would become a cornerstone of the abolitionist movement.
The movement gained significant traction in the 19th century, fueled in part by the powerful voices of Black abolitionists like Frederick Douglass. After escaping slavery in 1838, Douglass became a leading figure in the fight for freedom, using his eloquence and personal experiences to sway public opinion and expose the horrors of slavery. He wrote, "I have often been awakened by the shrieks of my own aunt, whom he used to tie up and whip, a chilling account of the brutality he had witnessed firsthand." The abolitionists faced immense obstacles, including the entrenched political power of the slaveholding states and the deep-seated racism that permeated American society. Even some of the founding fathers, who had expressed concerns about the institution of slavery, ultimately failed to dismantle it. Thomas Jefferson wrote in 1785 that the whole commerce between master and slave is a perpetual exercise of the most boisterous passions, acknowledging the moral depravity of the slave trade. But the invention of the cotton gin in 1793 had made slavery immensely profitable, and the economic interests of the South became deeply intertwined with the institution's survival. Southern resistance to abolition was fierce and unwavering. However, Nat Turner's rebellion of 1831, a bloody uprising led by an enslaved preacher, galvanized the abolitionist movement and sent shockwaves through the South. Turner's rebellion, which resulted in the deaths of over 50 white people, exposed the simmering anger and desperation of enslaved people and shattered the illusion of a docile and contented slave population. Thomas R. Gray, Turner's lawyer, wrote that he was a complete fanatic, a statement that reflected the fear and incomprehension with which many white Southerners viewed the rebellion. The abolitionist movement gained momentum through the tireless work of figures like Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, and Harriet Tubman. Sojourner Truth, a former slave who became a powerful advocate for both abolition and women's rights, famously challenged the prevailing notions of gender and race in her 1851 speech. "That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches. And ain't I a woman?" Her words resonated with audiences across the nation, highlighting the hypocrisy of a society that denied basic human rights to both enslaved people and women. The passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850 further inflamed tensions between the North and the South. This law, which required Northerners to assist in the capture and return of runaway slaves, outraged many in the North who saw it as a betrayal of their moral principles and an affront to their personal liberty. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1852, became a literary sensation, further turning public opinion against slavery by humanizing enslaved people and exposing the brutality of the system. Stowe wrote, "The law of God cannot be repealed by any human enactment," a powerful statement that challenged the legitimacy of laws that sanctioned slavery. Sectional tensions continued to escalate throughout the 1850s. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which allowed territories to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery, led to Bleeding Kansas, as pro- and anti-slavery forces clashed violently.
This escalating conflict, coupled with the ongoing debate over slavery's expansion, fueled the rise of the anti-slavery Republican Party. Their first presidential candidate, John C. Fremont, campaigned on a platform of free soil, free speech, free labor, and free men, a rallying cry that captured the growing sentiment against slavery in the North. The election of Abraham Lincoln as president in 1860 proved to be a pivotal turning point in American history. Lincoln, a Republican who opposed the expansion of slavery, was seen as a threat to the Southern way of life. His election triggered the secession of Southern states from the Union, leading to the outbreak of the Civil War. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, issued in 1863, declared enslaved people in rebel states to be free, a bold and decisive act that transformed the war into a fight not just to preserve the Union, but to end slavery once and for all.
In his second inaugural address, Lincoln reflected on the immense cost of the war and expressed his hope for a swift end to the conflict and a lasting peace. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. The legacy of slavery continues to shape America to this day. The millions who suffered, resisted, and fought for freedom must never be forgotten. Their stories remain essential to understanding who America is and what it must still strive to become.